All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for New Jersey Vital Records Adoption and Divorce. My name is Andrew Dauphney, and I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library. And our presenter today is Melissa Johnson, who is a professional genealogist, writer, and editor. She has expertise in researching families with origins in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and England, and works on forensic cases, dual citizenship matters, and lineage society applications. She is also proficient in using DNA test results to break through ancestral brick walls. She serves on the board of the Genealogical Society of New Jersey and the International Society of British Genealogy and Family History. She is reviews editor of the Association of Professional Genealogists Quarterly and editor of the Genealogical Society of New Jersey's newsletter, a publication of the Genealogical Society of New Jersey. Her work has been published in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, New York Genealogical and Biographical Record, NGS Magazine, Association of Professional Genealogists Quarterly, and numerous other publications. He is the program director for Boston University's Genealogy Studies program and frequently teaches courses at genealogy institutes around the country. So we definitely have an expert in all things genealogy with us today. There is a handout associated with today's program. Apparently the link is not working in the handout section of the dashboard. So I will be sending out a message to everybody periodically in the next few minutes so that as new people come in, they have access to the link. It should be a Dropbox link, and people are saying that that link is working, so please be on the lookout for that. If you have any questions today, we will be taking them at the end, but you can submit them at any time using the question box, or you can email me at my email address on the screen, which is adauphiny@njstatelib.org. There's a survey for this that will be in a follow-up email as well as prompted at the end of the webinar. If you could please complete that, we would greatly appreciate it. We always are looking for new ways to improve our programming and things. So all of your feedback definitely matters. And lastly, if you have any more genealogy questions or you're looking for more genealogy information, the New Jersey State Library does have a research guide available at the link on the slide, and I will send that out to everybody as well at the end of the presentation. That is managed by our genealogy librarian, Regina Fitzpatrick, and she'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about what resources we have at the State Library or maybe other family history questions. So before we start, for those of you who are new to GoToWebinar, this is what your dashboard should look like. If you do not see it, look for this orange box with a white arrow, either at the top left or right-hand corner of your screen. The dashboard may be closed, so you can click on that to open and close the dashboard. If you have any problems and can't figure anything out, and you maybe not knowing how to use the question feature or anything like that, you can use this raise hand feature right here. I will see, we'll get in contact you, and hopefully we can work out whatever the issues are. And then here in the questions area, you can just type in your questions, it'll get sent to me, and then we will take care of all questions at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to transfer it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so today we are going to talk about some of the most basic and essential record groups for genealogists. We're going to talk about vital records, adoption records, and divorce records. So we're going to touch on today vital registration in New Jersey, its history and the general process. We're going to talk about the records that are available and how they are organized. And then we're going to talk about some substitutes as well for if you can't find a vital record or you're working in the pre-vital records period. And then we will touch on two different types of adoption records that are available in New Jersey, as well as divorce records. So when we talk about vital records, we are talking about records of important or vital life events. So those are births, marriages, and deaths. I also, and many other genealogists, also consider adoption and divorce records as vital records or vital events, which is why they are lumped into this lecture that we're going over today. In more modern time periods, we also have, in addition to traditional births, marriages, and deaths, and even divorce and adoption, we have civil unions and domestic partnerships. And those are available typically from, in any state, but in New Jersey, from the same record issuing offices that issue births, marriages, and deaths. And in different states, these are maintained at different levels of government. So today we're, of course, talking about New Jersey, but many of the items we discuss are applicable for your research in other states, in Pennsylvania or California or Virginia. But we're going to talk about the different types of records that may be found at different levels of government and how they are different. So when we talk about New Jersey vital registration, it officially began on a statewide level in May of 1848. That being said, there were some records of births, marriages, and deaths kept through various other entities like churches or the counties prior to that. But when we talk about the state of New Jersey, vital registration began in 1848. In the very early years, let's say the first 30 years or so, compliance was very low. I have heard estimates that it was about at 40%. So if you are not finding a birth record for your ancestor in that very early period, it doesn't mean that they weren't born in New Jersey or that they weren't born in the place that you think they were born. It just means that probably their birth was not recorded as it should have been. Compliance was very low, and that gets higher if you live in, say, areas that are more rural, if you are not living in a city, or if you have a home birth, which most births were at home at that point in time, that can make it even worse in terms of compliance. Compliance was still a little bit low in the late 1800s, but it increased significantly by the early 1900s and has been pretty standardized since then. So when we talk about vital records in New Jersey and where you can find them, the two main places we're going to talk about today are the New Jersey State Archives and the New Jersey Department of Health's Office of Vital Statistics. One place that you will not find any vital records for the state of New Jersey is online. So many other states, if you're a member of Ancestry, you can find Pennsylvania death certificates online. You can find Vermont birth certificates. You can find marriage records for, various other states. In New Jersey, none of these actual records are online, but there are a lot of indexes available online, which is great. But the actual records themselves can only be obtained on site at different places in New Jersey. Again, these two, the State Archives and Vital Statistics, are going to be the places we talk about primarily, but you can obtain vital records at local record offices, say in the town you were born. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the New Jersey State Archives, the records that you can find there all begin essentially in 1848 when vital registration started, and births run through 1923. Delayed births, which we'll talk more about later, run through 1919 currently. Marriages through 1948. Deaths through 1960, and stillbirths also through 1919. The State Archives is a facility where you can go in and research. So all of those records for all of those years that I just mentioned are available to you if you go there and do research on site. So these cabinets right here, the first 4 or 5 rows of cabinets, are all vital records. So those are your births and marriages and deaths for all the years I just mentioned. So you can go there yourself and search. There are some indexes there on site and also available online and on their computers, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the vital records there are available for your use, which means you can search surname variants, you can search multiple years. If you're not sure, your ancestor was alive in 1930, but not in 1940, you can search yourself and make sure you're doing a good job. When we talk about vital statistics, there is some overlap between the New Jersey State Archives holdings and vital statistics in terms of years. Vital statistics holds records from 1920 to the present. So yes, some of the records at Vital Statistics are also at the state archives. Vital Statistics also holds records that are more recent, such as domestic partnerships and civil union records. If you look online on the Vital Statistics website, there are some guidelines on who can actually receive more recent vital records. So if you look online, these are kind of the guidelines that you'll get, is that people can apply for certifications, which is essentially a non-certified copy of a vital record, for births that are more than 80 years old, marriages more than 50 years old, and deaths more than 40 years old. The only difference between a certificate and a certification is that on the cause of death, there or on death certificates, there is no cause of death on certifications, and there's a big red watermark through them so that it's very evident that they are not certified copies. Again, if you look on the Department of Health Vital Statistics website, it says that in order for you to get these records, even if the birth is more than 80 years old or the marriage is more than 50 years old, that the parties on the record must be deceased. However, the way they actually operate is slightly different from what is online. Vital Statistics will issue more recent records, say a death record from 1989. That's not more than 40 years ago, or a marriage record that is, more than less than 50 years old. They will issue that, and they don't necessarily check to see if the person is deceased or not. I don't know if there has been a change in their kind of regulations, and they just haven't updated their website, or I don't know what the situation is, but the restrictions stated on the website are not how the agency operates in practice. So what they will issue to you in terms of more recent records are copies of the originals. So they won't retype a transcript, but that's okay, because as genealogists, we don't want typed transcripts. We want the originals where we can interpret the original handwriting ourselves, not what a clerk today is typing up on a transcript. And again, these are certifications only, which the only difference is the watermark. And for death records, you do not get the cause of death. The bad side about the Department of Health is that for these later records, you do not get to search yourself. So you essentially are sending them an application through the mail with information about the death record that you want, or you're going there in person and giving them an application. So you can do multi-year searches, say that ancestor that you're not exactly sure when they died, but you think it was between 1950 and 1960. You can submit a multi-year search through the mail, but not in a walk-in request. In the walk-in requests, you need to know all the information. You need to know the date, you need to know the person's name, and be able to fill out the application in its entirety. Those requests are $25 to submit a request. You essentially have to pay that as a search fee. So if they don't find the record, you still have paid that $25. It's a search fee. It's not a fee for a certificate. If they don't find it, you still are paying that amount. The certified copies, if you do need those, are available only to direct descendants of the person or persons on the record. So for example, I could get a certified copy of my great-grandfather's death certificate from Vital Statistics. He died in the 1970s. What I could not get is a certified copy of his brother's record, because he's not my direct ancestor. I am not his direct descendant. He's a great-great uncle of mine. So his descendants could get a certified copy, but I could not. But what I could get, again, is a certification. So if he died in the 1970s beyond what is available at the state archives, I could get a certification, which would be his death record minus the cause of death, and it would have that red watermark on it. So when you're talking about getting vital records, many genealogists have also obtained vital records from municipalities. Say, for example, if you know your ancestor died in Newark or Jersey City, you might go there to get the actual record. That's not the best way, and the reason for that is because sometimes the municipalities give you what's called a short form certificate. The state will always give you a long form certificate. So this is an example of a short form certificate. If we look at this, we can see there is quite a bit of missing information that a genealogist would want. Number one, we don't have her parents' names. That's something that's typically on a death certificate. Number two, we don't have the name of the informant. We don't know where she's buried. These are not pieces of information that are included on this record. And this is a typed transcript. So as genealogists, this is not what we want. This hits both kind of boxes of what we don't want. Number one, it's a short form, and number two, it's a transcript. So what we can see here, and this is sometimes what happens with a transcript, is that we have a place of death, 829 4th Avenue. If we look at the original record for Mary Agnes Johnson's death, this is what we want as genealogists. Even though it's hard to read, we'd rather have this than the typed transcript because we want to interpret that difficult handwriting ourselves. We don't want the clerk at the municipality to do it. So what we have on here is we can see her correct address. It's 82A 4th Avenue, not 829 4th Avenue. We also have a lot more information. We have the names of her parents, which is of course what we want as genealogists. We have the name and signature of the informant as well. So this is again why we always want to get records from the state, and we always want a copy of the original when we're asked on that form for vital statistics. We don't want a transcript. We want to check the box saying we want a copy of the original record. So actually finding vital records, so now that we know where they're located, we have to sometimes do a little bit of legwork to figure out what year the person died or when they lived, so that we can narrow down the time frame for the death. So again, because no New Jersey vital records are currently online where we can type in a box, Mary Johnson's name and see how many Mary Johnsons died and look at all the certificates as images to make sure which one is her. We can't do that. So we have to rely on indexes. And there are lots of indexes online. Some are better to use in certain instances than others, but there are a lot of great ones through Ancestry, through Family Search, and through Reclaim the Records, which we'll talk about more. And all of these references to different indexes are in your handout or your syllabus. So we're not going to go over each and every index, but if you look under births, marriages, and deaths, you'll see all the different indexes for different years and kind of what they will give you and where you can find them. So generally, everything prior to 1903 has an index. So births, marriages, and deaths prior to 1903, there's an index. Some of the records after 1903 have an index, but not all of them. The records after 1903, in some cases, you don't really need an index because they're filed alphabetically, and they are not the kind of record where you need to know a certificate number and go look it up, because they are mostly filed alphabetically by either the decedent or the person being born's last name or the groom's last name. So while prior to 1903, you're typically working with a certificate number that you need to go find that certificate number after you find the name in the index. After 1903, they're not really needed, but they sometimes are helpful if you don't know the year. For example, my prior example, if someone was in the 1930 census but not 1940, you don't want to have to search 1930, 1931, 1932 when you're at the state archives. If there was an index to use, then that would be really helpful. So some of the key online indexes, there are some on Family Search. So most of the births, marriages, and deaths prior to 1900 are on Family Search. One word of warning with these is that these are indexed by fiscal year in the state archives. So for example, they run from June of one year to May of the next year. So some of those entries, when Family Search indexed them, they didn't realize that. So some of those entries are actually off by a year because they thought that they were the entire year running January to December. So if you find something that looks a little bit off, you know that that person, died, in a certain time frame, but the Family Search entry says it's different. That's why. So these are good as a starting point to find that, and then using the indexes in the state archives when you're actually going to retrieve the record is also helpful. So the other indexes that are great are the New Jersey State Archives databases. These are better, I think, than the Family Search indexes because they give you the reference that you need to find the actual record, meaning they give you, for the marriages 1848 to 1878, they'll tell you that the marriage is in volume AD, page 392, and that's what you need to get the record. Same thing for the deaths. It will give you the specific reference to go find that record. The family search indexes, however, are great because they have more options in the search box. So if you don't know the child's name, or you suspect that the child was born and not given a name at birth, you can search by the parents' names. Or you can search by, I want to see all children born to Horace Johnson and his wife Fanny. And you might find some children that you didn't know about because they were either stillborn or they died in between censuses. Or you might find children that didn't have a name. So you're searching for your Aunt Margaret, but she wasn't Margaret when she was born. She was unnamed female child. So that's what family search is good for. So this is an example of what the family search indexes essentially look like. If you go on family search and search for an individual born somewhere in New Jersey in a certain age, birth year range, what you'll see there is a couple of different collections come up. So this first one obviously isn't the state vital record because it has a church associated with it. So these are church records that are indexed on family search. But if you keep looking, you will find collections that have New Jersey vital records. So this is the vital record, but there's also a church record for that person too. So this is a reference to that. But if we go here, it has a lot of good information. It has the parents' names, it has their ages, it has where they were born, as the information appears on the certificate. But what it doesn't give us is the reference number. So we need to get that from the on-site indexes at the state archives. This is an example of the online indexes that are on the State Archives website. This is a marriage index, and these are great because you can really kind of tweak the boxes and what you're going to put in them. So if you know the groom's last name and you wanted to search for, Horace Johnson, all the Horace Johnsons who got married during this time period, you could just fill in the groom's last name and the groom's first name. But another great way to use this index is, for example, if you know that a widow's name was Frances Johnson, but you're not sure what her husband's name is, you can change this so that you're only putting in the groom's last name and the bride's first name. So these are going to be all women named Frances who married a man with the surname Johnson. So that may help you find the couple that you're looking for. We're also going to go over some of the post-1900 online indexes. So these are fairly new. So if you've kind of stepped away from New Jersey genealogy the last couple years and are coming back, this is something that you might not already know about. A couple of years ago, an organization called Reclaim the Records was involved in obtaining through Freedom of Information Act requests, which is in New Jersey called OPRA, the Open Public Records Act, but it's basically the open records and transparency laws. They were able to obtain marriage and death indexes, which is great because they go through more recent years, 2016 and 2017, and will continue going on as the years go on. But they provided indexes so that when we're going to vital statistics and requesting a record from, say, 1965, we know that it exists, we know what year. There was no way of having that before. So on Ancestry, right now, there are indexes to births, marriages, and deaths from these Reclaim the Records requests. And those records are also available on Reclaim the Records, the website. So on Ancestry, it's a searchable database, just like many of them on Ancestry. And then on Reclaim the Records, you can actually download the images of the indexes, which are typed kind of transcripts of the indexes in most cases, and you can see the actual certificate numbers. So I typically start with Ancestry, but if I'm not finding what I'm looking for, I might browse the images on Reclaim the Records as well. So definitely check those out. There are some gaps in the New Jersey Death Index, and I know that there are some efforts to see if we can close those gaps. I'm not sure, how long that will take, but there may be some changes to that in the future. So this is an example of what the marriage index search interface looks like. As with anything on Ancestry, I recommend going to this specific collection in the card catalog and searching that way, rather than just searching globally on Ancestry's main search, because then you get family trees and military records and city directories and everything else mixed in, and it can be harder to find what you're looking for. So in here, I'm searching for William Morgan. So this is a very early search. This is, early records, marriages from the early 1900s. And if I, look, there's tons of William Morgans that were married during this time period. Or I can search by the bride's name, Sarah White. And I can find that Sarah White and William Morgan married in 1904. So there's multiple options. You can search by bride or groom. And when you're looking in here, if you go to the actual image, you can see more information. So Sarah White and William Morgan were married in 1904, but also click on that box to see the image as well. This marriage index also includes newer marriage records as well. So if you're kind of trying to retrace something that happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of the time people are trying to do that now with research into people who are adopted or your DNA matches. So this is my mom's maiden name, Jimkowski. And if I type that in, there's only a few of them, and it's my mom and her two brothers. It's all of their marriage records from the 1980s. So taking a look at that can be helpful for kind of reconstructing and finding reference to marriages that that took place more recently, so you can obtain those records. And then the Reclaim the Records, the indexes that they obtained are also available to browse. So this is what they look like. You do have to browse, and it's by section for marriages. So for example, 1904 to 1909 is one chunk of years. And then you have the next chunk of years. And they are separated by brides, the surname of the bride. So, A through F would be one section, and then, G through M would be another section. Also, there are plenty of indexes on site at the State Archives. They do have computers there, so you can access some of the State Archives indexes that we referenced before. They are readily available on their computers, but you can also access them at home. But they also have a lot of indexes on microfilm and in hard copy too. So everything, again, through 1903 has an index. We talked about those, and they are separated by section. So there are book indexes you can pull off the shelf and look. And if you know someone was born in, say, sometime in the 1850s, you can search, and you're definitely doing a comprehensive search because that index includes 1848 to 1878. So you're not going to miss something by a year or two. The next grouping is 1878 to 1890, then 1890 to 1900, and then so on. Then there's 1900 to 1903 indexes. Marriages, same thing. There's a 30-year chunk, 1848 to 1878. Those are available on the computer. They used to have hard copy indexes, but now they're on the computer, so they don't really need them anymore. You can still access them if requested, though. And then for deaths, there are also different groupings. So 1848 to 68, then 1868 to 78, then 1878 to 1900. The last grouping, 1878 to 1900, those typically were pretty rough to work with because they were annual indexes. So if you know someone died, say between the 1880 and 1895 state census, and there's no 1890 census in the middle, or you're searching a 10-year period, you did have to search 10 different indexes, and they were kind of by location, so you had to sort of guess at the location. Now those are online as a nice database, so that kind of takes away some of that element. And then again, after 1903, you don't need a ton of indexes for after 1903, but for that later period, the 60s, 70s, 80s, it can be helpful to have the index entry that we saw on Ancestry, and to be able to take that and order the record from Vital Statistics. So, but after 1903, if you know that the person died in 1933 because you have a cemetery record and you just want the death record, then you can just go to the 1933 deaths and go to Smith and look them up. So you don't need a certificate number like you did for prior years. This does change after 1949. You do go by certificate numbers, but there are nice indexes, again, year by year, for that. And those are now in the Ancestry database too, so that makes it even easier. So looking at some of the early indexes, this is an example of an index to births from 1890 to 1900. So when you're looking for someone, let's say we're looking for an Edna Johnson, And we know she's born, say, around 1892 or something, somewhere around there, 1898, 1896. And we look for Edna. Well, there's a whole bunch of Ednas. So how do we know which one is her? There's a couple ways. So we have the date, obviously. So if we know she's born around 1892, we can probably, rule out some of these other ones, the 1896, 7, 8, and the 1900. But if there are multiple in that category that are about, the same birth range, we do have the father's initials here. So this column next to the name where you see from the top W, S, W, G, L, those are the father's initials. So if we know Edna's father's name was Albert, then we have maybe some more confidence that that first 1892 entry is for the person we're looking for. We also have a place location. So if you're looking at the second blue arrow down at the bottom, that's pointing to the second number in that middle column of numbers, you see it's pointing to 47, but above that there's 75 and 43 and another 47. So that's a location. For example, 47 that we're pointing to here is Jersey City. 36 is Newark. And there's a guide at the state archives that tells you what each number refers to. So if you know where the family's from, you know the person's, father's name, you can pretty easily pinpoint which Edna or which Douglas or which Edith is the person that you're looking for. Also in these indexes, as I mentioned, a lot of people were born and they didn't have their names on their birth certificates initially. So always in these indexes, look to the very beginning of the surname category and take a look there for the unnamed males and unnamed females. And again, they have the father's surname. So in here, these are Johnson males with a father who has a forename beginning with the letter C. So if the father's name is Charles Johnson or Carl Johnson, these are all going to be children, male children, born to males that are C. Johnson. So look in there, and if you're finding a birth date and maybe a place that matches up with the person you're looking for, but the person doesn't have a name, you might want to look at that certificate and see if the parents' names match up, because your uncle Albert might not have had a name when he was born, but you can still find his birth certificate and have pretty good confidence that it's him based on other sources that you might have and other information. So when you're looking at records in New Jersey, birth records, in the early period, they're what's called registers. So 1848 to 1878, the records are register format, which means there's a whole bunch of births on one sheet of paper. Then after that, you get certificates, which is typically what we know and still use today. So this is a typical birth register. So this is a register of births in Newark. And this is from 1859 to 1860. And you'll see here a lot of these columns are not actually filled in. So we have the date of birth, and these are all in 1859. So we have June 8th, June 14th, June 18th. All of them are in Newark. None of them have the name of the child. They all have the gender of the child, and they have under the column for names of parents, it's just the father's name. And sometimes it's not even the full father's name. Sometimes it's just the father's first initial and last name. In some cases, for an out of wedlock birth, you might see the mother's name in this column. But the occupation of the father and the residence of the parents, those columns are blank. So there's a lot of variety with these registers. Some of them are completely filled in. Some of them have very little information like this one, and some of them are a mix of what's in between those two. So this is a typical birth register. This is for one of my relatives, is actually the top person on here, the daughter of Alfred Johnson. Later on, we have certificates. So those certificates had not as much information in the very beginning. So this is one from 1882. This is another one where there's no name. I know this is my Aunt Margaret because I know her birthday was July 20th, 1882. I know she was born in Orange and that those are her parents. So it does say the ages of her parents, occupation, where they were born, and it says that there were 6 children born of the marriage with 5 living, and there was a deceased child in there somewhere. So that's great information. on there. And then if you continue on to later birth certificates, for example, this is my dad's, and he was born in 1947. It has a lot of the same information on the one that you saw from 60 years prior to that. So it has his parents' names, their birthplaces, has their ages, what their color or race was, and it has my grandfather's occupation. It also has some medical information about a blood test during pregnancy and what type of eye drop was used for the baby. Um, and then it also has information about how many other children were born to the mother, how many months of pregnancy the mother had. So there is some more medical information on these certificates. And it does have a little more information about the place of birth versus the address of the parents, which as time went on and more births were done in hospitals, that was more common. I also wanted to bring to your attention that there are often corrections or additions to birth certificates, especially in New Jersey. They are on the microfilm reel. So when you're looking at a birth certificate on a microfilm reel, go just before and just after it to make sure there's not a correction or an addition, especially if that person was born without a name or with a different name than what you knew them as. So this is a correction and addition. Actually, we're going to look at both for my uncle, Charles Bicker. So when he was born, he did not have a name on his birth certificate, and they mistakenly listed him as a female child instead of a male child. So this corrects his name. So they had initially added his name to it, and they had added the name Casimir Bicus to the record. And they later added his actual name that he used, which was Charles John Bicker, and changed the gender on the birth certificate. And you can see that this was done in 1971. It tells you his address in Wall Township, which is where he lived for most of his adult life. And this is, done in the 1970s and put on the microfilm reel. So the microfilms were done in I believe, the late 70s. So if you have somebody who corrected their birth record prior to that, they're going to be on the microfilm reel. If they corrected their birth in, say, the 1990s, it wouldn't be on there because it was done after filming. The early marriage records are also something that comes in a register format in the early period. So again, this is another one that not all the columns are filled in, and in some cases they change the columns and put information that they wanted to put instead of what the column actually called for. So these are marriages that took place in Jersey City in the 1870s, in 1870 actually. So we have in here the first one, which is Horace Condit Johnson and Frances Eleanor Morgan. It lists their residences, and it lists, instead of the names of their parents, it lists names of witnesses. I don't know any genealogist who would want the witnesses over the names of the parents, in most cases anyway, but you can see they crossed out names of parents and put witnesses there. They did also have, their residents, who married them, whether they were single or widowed, and the date of the marriage. So this is another example of how the registers are sometimes not 100% conform to what information they call for. Later on, we do have certificates. So this is an 1882 marriage certificate. It has a ton of information. Has the names of both parties, the names of their parents, where the parents were born, whether the marriage was the first or second or third. So there is some information that's added to this later on. For example, this certificate tells us that it's a first marriage for both, but if it wasn't, it would just say number 2. It wouldn't say how the prior marriage ended. It wouldn't say whether the person was a widow or divorced or, anything like that. Afterwards, you can see this is a little bit later, 1921, when we ask number of marriage, 1 or 2, which in this example for the groom, it's number 1. For the bride, it's number 2. They do ask by saying cross out words not essential. So cross out the words that don't apply. So this indicates, since single and widow is crossed out for the bride, that she was divorced. So the later records do tell us a little bit about how that other marriage ended. Aside from that, they do include most of the same information. I did want to note that there is an interesting collection of non-resident marriage licenses at the New Jersey State Archives. So what these are, and they're only available for certain counties, they are marriage licenses for people who didn't live in New Jersey, but who got married in New Jersey. So these are great if you have ancestors who maybe had relatives here but weren't living here at the time, but they did get married here. A lot of them are for people from New York, especially the ones for Hudson County. They are for people from New York who weren't allowed to get married in New York because they had a prior divorce that forbade them from getting remarried. And they have a lot of great information. It's basically 4 pages and it's a questionnaire. So if you have anyone who married in New Jersey in the early part of the 1900s, you may want to check those out. There also are marriage licenses that are available by the municipality in some cases. So these are not available by every municipality, but Newark does keep them. There are a couple other towns as well who keep them. And they can be really helpful too, because sometimes the marriage license includes some information that didn't make it onto the certificate. Here's an example of one. It does have like a couple of questions. It's a little bit of a questionnaire. Sometimes it has a permission from a parent if the one of the parties to the marriage was young. So that might be of interest at some point for a certain case. And then for death records, again, we have registers in the early period. Sometimes not everything is included. You'll see here there's a names of parents column that is left completely blank for all of these entries. But sometimes you do find the names of parents. It's really kind of hit or miss depending on how they filled out the register. Death records, as you move on, you have certificates. So this is from 1889. There are certificates from in the 1878 to 1890-ish period. Sometimes people find the index and they think that's a certificate. That's not the case. There are certificates for this time period. And this provides a lot of, great information. You have, where the person was born, where the person died, who their parents were, what they died of, lots of good information here. And even though it's cut off at the bottom, you do have the place of burial as well. Later on, you have a little bit more information. Sometimes you have an informant's name, which isn't included on that prior certificate. And then sometimes there's an addendum to a death certificate too. So just like on the births, always look at the page after or the page before to make sure there's not a little note from the coroner, or especially if it's a suspicious death, or a note on the burial or anything like that. And this continued basically up until more recent times, same practice with certificates. And this is an example of one from 1994. At the state archives, there also are stillbirth records. So they have them, I believe, up until the last, they have them that are 100 years old or more, is what I should say. So right now, I think they have them through about 1919. Some of them are still in the back. They're not microfilmed, but a lot of them are microfilmed and in the cabinets with the other records. So this is an example of one. It typically tells you that, the place of the stillbirth, the parents' names, how many months pregnant the mother was, how many previous children they had, and then how the body was disposed of. So if it's a very it's an earlier pregnancy, sometimes there's not a place of burial, but in this case there was. So sometimes, even though we've searched all these indexes and we've looked at all these records, we can't actually find the record we are looking for. So a couple of suggestions: definitely look at surname variants. So definitely make sure that you're trying to spell that name as in as many awful ways as you can, because that's how it could be spelled on the record. There also could be a filing error. So even if the name is spelled right, it could be really poorly written, and maybe an R is taken as a K and it's filed under a letter that looks similar. Also, make sure you're searching the right years and the right dates. So definitely expand your search to a couple years outside of what you think it is, especially if you're going by family lore, or if you're looking at the family search indexes, definitely look a year off from those. And then expand on location locations as well. So just because a family lived in New Jersey doesn't mean that they married in New Jersey or died in New Jersey or their child was born there. And we're going to look at a couple of examples. So this was a client case that I worked on. This is for a client's father, Alfred Rosa, and he had this record of his birth. So we knew he was born in New Jersey. We knew the date. October 1st, 1920. And when I went to go find the long form copy, because again, this is a short form that was signed by the local registrar and that doesn't have all the information that we needed, I went to go find the actual certificate and I couldn't find it. I looked under Rosa where it should have been. I looked in 1920 and it wasn't there. I looked under the, just Rosa births, not Alfred, in case he wasn't born with a name and someone mistakenly, wrote it that way, even though that's not how it should have been written if it wasn't on the record that way. So it wasn't there. So what I was able to do was look in the geographic birth indexes, which we'll talk about in a minute, and I found that Rosa was actually filed under K. So it was under Alfred Cosa, or Coso, I should say. So this is the actual record. So it's, if you look at the father's name, it's corrected under there. They kind of corrected that to make it look like an R, but they did not correct it under the K name, or under Alfred Coso, under the child's name. So in here, it was filed with the K's, not with the R's. Even though the name was actually Rosa or Rosso, which I would have found because I would have looked for Rosa and Rosso in my search. So this is a good example of how things, if you think of how you would write a letter, think of how it could be messed up or mistransposed into a different type of letter and filed differently. Also think about other locations. So there are a couple of common Gretna greens for New Jersey couples depending on the time period. So in the colonial era, depending on where they lived in New Jersey, a lot of people married in Delaware, a lot of people married in Kings County, which was Brooklyn. A lot of people married in New York, especially if they were Dutch or Presbyterian. And then people who lived in South Jersey outside of Philadelphia sometimes went there to marry. Also, in the 20th century, Elkton, Maryland was also a common place where New Jersey couples went to get married because there was no waiting period. And this was especially the case if there was some kind of impediment to the marriage in New Jersey. Say, for example, the groom was still married to his prior wife, or the bride maybe was still married, or there was some kind of reason why they couldn't get married locally. Another important resource that a lot of people miss because they only were recently microfilmed, they've been manuscript collections at the State Archives for a very long time, but they're only recently microfilmed, is the geographic birth indexes. So these are essentially lists of births that are arranged first by location. So if you know someone, perhaps was born in Union County or in Newark or in Jersey City, you would look them up by location. And the location is a little bit tricky because some of the bigger cities are by themselves, but then some of the smaller cities are grouped together in the county listing. So in Union County, for example, the smaller towns like Hillside or Union Township would be grouped together in this Union County listing that you see there. But Elizabeth, which was in Union County, would have its own listing. So if you're looking for a child that's born in Elizabeth, you wouldn't be looking here. If you're looking for a child that was born in Union Township, you would be looking here. But they are first by location within a set of years. So these are, I should back up a minute. So these are available for 1904 to 1929, but they are broken down into smaller time period chunks. So this one that we're looking at is for 1925 through 1929. And it's for Union County. Then it's by the first letter of the surname. So these are essentially all of the people who were born in Union County between 1925 and 1929 with the surname M. And if you look in the third column in the image, you can see the date. So the 6 next to April is for 1926. So even though this is 1925 to 29, we're looking at a listing for 1926. So these are births. For example, Alan Markham, he's born 1926, April 2nd, somewhere in Union County. Next one, Belford Millering. He's born in 1926, but on April 3rd. So why would you want to use these? You might be asking. These are, records that are indexed. Number one, this example is 1925 to 1929. So this is not a an example of something that is available at the state archives in terms of the actual record. So you would have to go to vital statistics for this, but you would also need to know kind of at least the general time frame. So at least, if you're trying to request Alan Markham's birth record, his birth date is April 2nd, 1926, and he was born in Union County. Another reason you might want to use this is if you're searching for someone's birth, say your grandmother, and she was born in Newark, and her birth date because you celebrated it every year, but you're not finding her birth certificate. And maybe your grandmother is Italian or Polish, and you suspect that her birth record is buried under some mangled name. Or you have someone who is adopted and their birth record, where they were born, but you don't know the original surname. You can go through these and look at the actual indexes. This one in particular, when I was looking for someone's birth in here, I was looking for, if you look about halfway down the page, you see Kazimiera Mikowski. I'm going to say Mikowski. I'm not sure how that's pronounced, but that's a surname that was spelled very, very differently from what's on here. But I did know the person's general birthplace, and I did know that the person's general birth date. I knew it was sometime in June of 1926. So by looking at this, I now have the exact spelling that's on the certificate, and I can go look it up on the certificate. So it's really good for if you can't find a birth certificate that might be mangled under another spelling. And the good part is they also have these for deaths as well. So same thing, if you're not finding a death certificate and you suspect it's under a spelling that you're just not thinking of, you can look at these if you know kind of the general place where the person died and the year and the month and things like that. And generally, if a surname is mangled, it's not like the example of Rosa and Cosa. Usually the first name of the surname that's being mangled is probably the same. For example, this M name, I figured it was under M. That might not be the case with names that start with like a K or a C, or a V or a W, but then at least you have one other surname first letter to search. You're not searching A through Z. So these are really helpful in some cases. And then, so we are going to talk a little bit about divorce records. So divorce records are my absolute favorite types of records to look at in New Jersey. Unlike other states, they are open to the public. There are select cases that are sealed. One, for example, if you recall our former Governor McGreevey, who had a very public divorce that involved political campaigns and things like that, that's a case that's sealed. But your everyday people, your ancestors who just had a nasty divorce, that's not going to be sealed. But they are open to the public. Some of the early divorces prior to the 1840s, they were done by an act of legislature. So those records are published in the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey and also in The Record, which is the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society's publication. So there's not too much information on those. You can find the legislative act that granted the divorce and the publication in GMNJ. The indexes are a great resource. But for those early divorces, you're not going to find all the great, interesting information that we want as genealogists. But after that, divorces were handled through the Chancery Court. And that was beginning in the 1840s up till 1948. And these records are all available at the New Jersey State Archives. It's sometimes a little bit of a process to go through them because first you have to look in an index and that leads you to a docket book. Then you look in the docket book and find the case file number, and then you look up the case on microfilm. So it's a little bit of a process, but definitely worth it because these are great, fantastic records. After that, between 1949 to the present, the Chancery Court sort of turned into the Superior Court. So that's where those records are. There used to be a Superior Court Information Center where you could walk in and get these. That has since closed. And actually, I need to correct something that's in my handout. So you used to be able to send in an email request for a case file. Now you do have to send that by mail. So the email address in your handout where you can request these records, if you email them, you'll get an automatic response back with the address where you need to mail your request. So that's a very recent change. For very recent records, even though they were granted through the Superior Court of New Jersey, they are not with the state, they're still held with the county. So the counties file their records with the state every 10 or 8 years or so, depending on the county. So for a recent record, if you want a copy of a 2013 divorce, that is probably still with the county that it was granted in. So you would contact the Superior Court Family Division for that county. Recent divorces are less likely to include kind of the juicy genealogical information we're usually looking for, because nowadays most people who are getting divorced, they go through mediation and basically they come to an agreement, present that to a judge, and the divorce documents are not very voluminous in terms of what happened during the mediation process. But I'm going to go through some examples of divorce cases that show really interesting information. So this is a divorce for Frances May Hyde and her husband George. So the divorces are great because if you aren't sure where a person got married and they got divorced, you can always look in the divorce, because part of getting divorced is establishing the fact that you were married. So they will always have the date of the divorce or date of the marriage and the place of the marriage. So in this example, they were married February 9th, 1907 by W.H. Morgan in Newark, New Jersey. So this is a petition of the wife, Frances, filing for divorce against her husband, George. And then you have some of the accusations that come into play. And there are lots of accusations in divorce records. Remember to take them with a grain of salt. Just like when people get divorced today, they might claim things that are not true for financial advantages or child custody arrangements and things like that. So definitely try to verify them with other sources, which I was able to do with this one. So this, the petitioner, the wife, says that basically, since she married her husband on these specific days, he committed adultery with a woman named Ellen Donnelly in Arlington, New Jersey. And then there's, continued testimony that basically he came home, he had left his wife for a while, he was gone, and then he came home and admitted to her that he had had an affair with this woman, Helen Donnelly or Ellen Donnelly. And he told his wife that he had a child by Helen, that the child had died, and Helen had also since died of tuberculosis. So he came home after being gone for a while and admitted that to his wife. So those are just some of the really interesting things you can find in divorce records. There are lots of details about children and financial arrangements. In that particular divorce, I was able to find a falsified marriage record between him and Helen Donnelly, and then also the birth of their child and the death of their child, which named George as the father. So that kind of testimony usually is able to be verified, but you'll find a lot of information too about domestic violence and different things like that you really should try to verify those things before you accept them as 100% true. So moving on to adoption records, we're going to talk about two different types of records: birth certificates, which are the original pre-adoption birth certificates, and then adoption records, which are the court judgments. So these are two very different things that have different rules in terms of obtaining them. So we'll talk about the adoption records first. In New Jersey, in 1940, there was an act that sealed adoption records going from that point forward. The act was not retroactive. So basically what this means is that adoptions that took place prior to November 19th, 1940 are open. They're with the surrogate's office where the adoption took place, and anybody can obtain them. So they are not sealed. Some of the counties, I'll warn you, don't fully understand that, and they will tell you they're sealed. They are not. You can print a copy of this law that I've cited here. And if you are going into a courthouse looking for an adoption, I would suggest bringing it with you, because it states very clearly that anything pre-1940 is available to the public, that is not sealed, and they cannot keep those records from you. Anything after 1940 is sealed, though. They can sometimes be obtained by the person who is adopted seeking access. I have heard people say that they have done this successfully. I don't know 100% sure of anybody who has, but it would be done through a court order. So again, those records up to 1940 and actually into 1953, even though the only ones that are open are through November 1940, are with the county surrogate. After that, adoptions are with the New Jersey Superior Court between 1954 and 1979. And again, this is when the adoption took place. And then after that, they're with the county surrogate again. Those second two bullets don't matter so much because they are not available to us as researchers, but it might be good to know if you are planning to petition to get your own adoption record. The adoption records from that pre-1940 period that are available to anybody, they have a lot of great information. This is an example of one for Horace Johnson and his wife Grace, who adopted a little girl named Dorothy Marie Flummerfelt. And she was 7 months old. She was living with them when they petitioned for the adoption. And it tells you the name of the child's mother. Her name was Catherine Flummerfelt, and she lived in Vienna, New Jersey, which is quite a ways away from Hudson County, where this adoption was taking place. Typically, it usually acknowledged that the adoption records usually acknowledge the mother and father's names. If there's some reason why they can't acknowledge the father, they usually state that. For example, here, the father of the child has abandoned and deserted the mother prior to the birth of the child. Sometimes you'll see that it's the opposite, that the father is placing the child for adoption, perhaps because his wife has died and he can't care for it. So these are great. They will give you typically the names of the birth parents, which is great if you're trying to research that lineage. Typically it's mostly the mother, but sometimes it's the father as well. So those are the court records. The birth certificates are different. Remember, the court records are different than the birth certificates. In 2017, just a couple years ago, as of January 1st, original birth certificates were made available to adoptees and their direct descendants. So for example, if your father was an adoptee and he's deceased, you can get this record. But if your cousin was an adoptee, you would not be able to get that. That's not a direct relative of yours. But these, again, are not adoption records. They are not talking about who adopted the person. They're talking about this is the original birth certificate prior to the adoption taking place. So the adoptee or their immediate relatives have to submit a request to the Department of Health. And just some background, prior to this taking place, there was, I believe, a 3-year period where the birth parents of children who were born could have petitioned to have the birth record sealed or their name removed from it. And from what I understand, there were only a handful of people who actually did that. So most of these were, are going to be available with with the parents' names on them as they appeared on the original record. But there was the opportunity for the birth parents to have their name redacted. So this is an example of an original birth record. This is from 1928, and this is for Charles Gerard. His parents were Charles and Doris. It says that his parents were married. He says he's a legitimate child. In many cases, you don't have a father's name on here. In many cases, you just have the mother's name. And in some cases, there's not a whole lot of information. In some cases, also, the information is falsified. This is an example of one. So you would think that with the information given here, Charles Gerard at a certain address in Newark, and who was born in Newburgh, New York, and who was a government employee, you would think you would be able to find that person. Unfortunately, this information is all falsified. So sometimes that does happen in extreme cases, but a lot of the time when a when a child was, born and adopted out, they were born to a very young unwed mother, or, a woman who already had, 4 children and couldn't take care of another one. So sometimes the information is correct and can be used to track down the birth family. Um, so keep that in mind. This is an example of what that would look like if you requested an original birth record. It does state on there that this is not a certified copy, so these are informational copies only, because again, this person's identity was changed and they have a separate birth certificate, a post-adoption birth certificate that is their official record. So that is about all we have on vital records, adoption, and divorce. But Andrew, I'm happy to take any questions that we have.
Great, thank you so much. There's a lot of great information in there. Let's see, so everybody, if you have any questions, you can submit them using the question feature in the GoToWebinar dashboard, or if you have my email address, that's adauphinee@njstatelib.org. You can email me there as well. So, all right, let's see what we have coming in. All right. Is anyone working on creating the marriage record indexes for 1904 to 1919 or 1930 to 1948 through Reclaim the Records or any other group?
I'm sorry, Andrew, you cut out there for a second. All I
Oh,
caught was the end of that: reclaim the records or any other group.
is anybody working on the death indexes for 1904 to 1919 or 1930 to 1948?
So that's a good question. What I've heard about those is that, so if you look at the actual records that are available for those years, 1904 to 1919, and the other chunk, they actually, so they're all alphabetical by surnames. So essentially, if somebody's born 1931 and their name is Melissa Johnson, you go to Johnson Melissa and you find the record. So what I was told is that there actually are not any indexes from that time period. Because they were so easy to find, they were, alphabetical by surname starting in 1904. So what I was told is that there aren't any indexes that exist from that time period, which is why they were not provided when Reclaim the Records did their Oprah request. And what I understand also is that under an Oprah request, you are requesting records that actually exist. So you're not asking for something to be created that doesn't exist. You're foiling or Oprahing records that actually exist. So because there are no indexes, that's why they were not provided. However, I have also been told that there's a law that requires indexes to be kept for vital records. So I believe what Reclaim the Records is doing now is they're trying to get the state to enforce that law to create indexes so that they can be requested under the Open Public Records Act. I don't know how successful they have been, but that was kind of the last update that I had heard. But that hopefully will explain why they don't exist for that time period, and why they are not available on Reclaim the Records.
All right. The next question is there a locality code index for the pre-1949 marriage index?
There are definitely some missing locality codes. I don't know specifically exactly which years are missing for which vital events, but I would check at the state archives. They have some locality codes. You may also want to look up Debbie Hadley is a professional genealogist in New Jersey, and she has a website that has some of the locality codes for New Jersey. So I would check those two places, but there are some that are missing, that have missing gaps.
All right. I'm having great difficulty finding a death certificate for my great-great-grandmother who died in New Jersey in 1860. I searched the death indexes at the archives but cannot locate her. What would be some next steps in possibly finding her on a more local level, such as municipality, church?
So depending on what religion the great grandmother was, you could possibly look for a church burial record, which if they were Catholic or or were buried in a churchyard cemetery of some sort, there may be a record there. You may also search newspapers too, depending on where they lived. Have a better chance of that if they lived in a big city. And then, also you may look to cemetery records too. So sometimes, there is no death record just because it wasn't recorded, but you have a cemetery record that can provide you essentially the same information you would typically find on a death record.
All right. What if the child lived as a boarder with a family in Orange, Essex, New Jersey from 1880, age 8, until a wedding in Orange in 1860 or 1896? Would there be any records available?
So a lot of the time, if a child was living as a boarder, there may not have been a formal adoption that took place. Um, you may want to search for guardianship, which is it's different than an adoption because it focuses not on who's going to care for the child and take care of it every day, but it focuses on the child's property. So if the child did have property that was inherited from a parent, there may be a guardianship, but a lot of the time, unfortunately, children were just kind of taken informally into homes of, a relative or an acquaintance, and there was never a formal adoption. So, reconstructing that person's life, between point A and point B would essentially be, using a lot of the same sources we typically would look at, city directories to follow, and, where they lived and the family they were living with, what happened to them. When you're looking at vital records, you may want to look at the border family's name as well as, the actual name of the child, assuming it's different. So, I've seen a lot of cases where, the child is using the family name that they're living with rather than their own, historical family name. Yeah, so those are kind of some of the options I would look for in the absence of a formal adoption or guardianship.
All right. What is the required relationship one must have to obtain a birth certificate from 1947? Is it limited to the actual adoptee, or can it be a family member?
So if this is a question related to the original birth certificate of an adoptee, it would be either the adoptee or their children or grandchildren would be able to obtain that. Also, the adoptee's adoptive parents could obtain it, but I'm assuming if they were born in 1947, those parents are probably deceased. So I think that's the extent of, I believe, who can obtain it. I don't know if the spouse of the adoptee could obtain it. But you can look on the Vital Statistics website. All of the rules of who can obtain it are available there. But I'm not sure about the spouse, but definitely the children can obtain it.
Um, are there any COVID-related restrictions to on-site searching?
So that's a good question. So right now everything is closed. We don't really know when things are reopening, but right now all the state offices are currently closed.
Yes, so the state library is closed, the state archives is closed, your Department of Health and all of that for the vital statistics, that's all closed. So I would monitor the different state agencies for information on when they would be reopening. And if they do reopen, it's probably going to be a staggered reopening. So some services might not be available right away. So, but they will post any restrictions or anything related to any on-site activities for the public. So just it'll take some time. I can say that much. Do you have any suggestions about how to obtain information on a son my grandmother had out of wedlock and put up for adoption prior to her marriage to my grandfather in 1951? He was born sometime between 46 and 51.
Okay, that's a good question. So that's definitely after the adoption records are available to the public. A couple of things I would suggest. So depending on the county, sometimes you can glean some information from the surrogates indexes. So for example, I mentioned that the records up until the 1950s are with the surrogate's office, even though they are only open to the public until 1940. But they are often, and this depends on the county, so it's a real hit or miss, they are often included in the surrogate's docket, the adoptions, along with wills and administrations and things like that. So if you know, your grandmother's maiden name or the name she had this child under, you can look under that surname and see all the wills and administrations, and you may be able to see an index entry for the child's adoption in there, and it may reference, say volume 10, page 20, or something like that in the index. If you have a kind of an inkling of maybe what the adoptive name would be, or if you are motivated enough to search through many books, you would be able to cross-reference the name of the pre-adoption name in the index and whatever volume and page it leads you to the index page that has the adoptive name on it. So for example, if it was my grandmother who had a child out of wedlock, I would look under Johnson and I would maybe see that child's adoption under Johnson, and it would be volume 10, page 20. And then I thought maybe the adoptive name was Smith. I would look under Smith, and if there's a Smith, volume 10, page 20, that would be the child's adoptive name. So that, again, is very hit or miss depending on how the county's books are organized. There's only a couple counties that would work in. The other thing I would also recommend, aside from that, because it's really difficult to find a child that was placed for adoption, from the birth family side. So you have less information because of, unless you knew the child's adoptive family's name. Another thing I would suggest definitely would be DNA testing, because if that child or their children ever took a DNA test, they would show as a match to you as well. So that would be primarily autosomal DNA testing to test with Ancestry, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage. Primarily Ancestry is the biggest one. If someone were to take a test, it would probably be there. But that's, generally how you would also find someone who's adopted out of a family.
All right. We have another question. I have a copy of the final divorce decree for the husband I'm researching, dated January 15th, 1925, under the heading "In Chancery of New Jersey." It contains little information about the couple. So 2 questions. Would there be additional records associated with this divorce where I might find other facts about the husband and wife, such as those juicy accusations or pleadings, and where would I look for that information?
Yes, absolutely. There's going to be more information. So if it's a 1920 something divorce, those records are at the state archive. So you want to go in and, you'll look in the the indexes that are available there. You'll find the name, which there's a divorce decree issued. So you may want to search back a couple years, because sometimes the divorce can take a year or more. So you would want to search that general time period. You would find the divorce that would lead you to, the docket books. The docket book would give you a case number, and then you look up the case number, and it could be a 20-page divorce, it could be a 400-page divorce, but typically, there will be the initial petition that says, we were married on this date, I'm seeking a divorce, and why, and then whoever initiated the divorce files that, and then the response. Sometimes there is no response and the divorce just kind of goes on, but sometimes there's a response, lots of arguing and testimony from relatives and things like that. But yes, absolutely. So the document you have is just the decree, and it's just one page of what happened at the very end of the whole process. So yes, you would go to the state archives when and they reopen and get that whole thing. And it may be a very civil, calm divorce, but it could be, 400 pages of interesting reading for you as well.
Okay. Let's see. Can a person find, oh, I'm sorry, there was a follow-up question to the one you just answered. The husband apparently remarried within a couple
Oh.
years, and the eldest child of the second marriage was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1928. I have been unable to find the second marriage record. Where should I search? And this person lives in Texas, so on-site search would be difficult.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely would look in the marriage indexes that are available for the New Jersey marriages. When you're searching on Ancestry, there are a couple of years that if you're searching by the husband's name, which is probably what you know more, there are a couple years where the husband's name is not the name, it's just initials. So for example, John Smith is indexed as JS. So if you're just typing in John Smith, it's not going to come up. So if you know the wife's name or maiden name, that would be helpful to search under the second wife's maiden name. Aside from that, use the initials in that Ancestry marriage index. Use the initials of the groom, and that might get you some other results that you're not finding. Otherwise, you may check Elkton, Maryland as well. Unfortunately, a lot of these are only available on site. So if you're not available, if you're in Texas, you may need to hire a local researcher or contact the archive and see if they offer a search service for that. But yeah, I definitely would look at nearby locations. So after you do a comprehensive search of the New Jersey indexes, because that's the most obvious place, look at Elkton, Maryland. You might look at New York City as well. So yeah, but hopefully you find it in New Jersey. Just make sure you're looking with the groom's initials, not the full name in some cases.
All right. Can a person find people who lived in orphanages?
So a lot of the time, orphanage records are sealed for the privacy of the individuals who were housed there. Even if it's 120 years old, they are sealed. So the best bet, sometimes you can find reference to the person living in an orphanage in the census, because orphanages were enumerated just like everybody else in the census. And then aside from that, you can, if you know the orphanage, you can contact whoever has the records now, but in most cases, in my experience, they would be sealed.
Okay. Was there a residency requirement for divorce around 1860?
I don't know the answer to that question. That's a good question, and unfortunately I don't know the answer to it.
All right. And a similar question, was there a residency requirement for marriage in the state around 1880?
I don't specifically know the laws during that time, but I want to say no, because I have seen many marriage records in New Jersey for people who did not live in New Jersey during that time period. So there may have been a special license. I know, a little bit later than 1880, around the 1890s into the early 1900s, there was a special, marriage license you had to apply for. To get married in New Jersey, but based on what I've seen, I don't believe there was a residency requirement there.
Alrighty. It looks like that's it for the questions right now. We can wait a couple more minutes, see if anybody has any other things, but I did post in the chat for everybody a link to our genealogy research guide, as well as the Debbie Hadley place codes that you had mentioned before. One of our attendees sent that information to me. So.
Great. And while we're waiting, if you don't mind, Andrew, I can mention a couple of other New Jersey opportunities for research. So if you go to NewJerseyFamilyHistory.com, there are 2 New Jersey kind of more in-depth courses coming up. One of them is a 2-day course that covers kind of everything you want to know about New Jersey family history research. That's not until December. It's the first weekend in December. But prior to that, there's something new that is being offered that hasn't ever been offered before. It's called the New Jersey Genealogy Research Practicum. And it's going to be in August. It's a different kind of format. Basically, the group of students who wants to attend the research practicum, which is open to anybody, will meet on 4 consecutive Saturdays in the afternoon. And basically, the format is the first Saturday you'll be presented with a New Jersey research problem, and then you can work for the next week either alone or with a partner that's also in the class on solving that problem. And then you regroup the next week to kind of discuss, what approach you took, what, kind of how you approached it, what you found, and then the case will be, the resolution to the case will be presented in a paper and through a presentation as well. So that's 3 different cases covering kind of same process over 4 weeks. So it's something that's new and different if you're looking for kind of a different kind of learning opportunity that's a little more hands-on. And those are all New Jersey Family History Institute courses. So it's just NewJerseyFamilyHistory.com is where you can find some more information about those.
Great. I posted a link in the chat for everybody. We got another question that came in. Any suggestions for earlier birth or marriages before 1848 besides church records?
So for marriages, there are county clerks marriages, and there's a little bit about them in your handout. So they don't tell you a whole lot. They basically will tell you the names of the parties and the date and the minister, but they are kept there. They started in like about 1785, and they actually continued until the 1870s. So there's some overlap between New Jersey vital registration and those. But they are county marriages, so they were kept by the county clerks, and they are available online. There also are marriage bonds, and there's a database to them on the State Archives website. Those are for the very earlier period, the 1700s. And aside from that, really, I know you said except for church records, you might want to check newspapers as well. So a lot of those records I just mentioned kind of coincide with each other and can lead you to another one. For example, if you find a newspaper reference to a marriage, it would tell you, by Reverend so-and-so, and you can look up that minister and figure out what church they were with, and then find the church record. And then you may also find the same thing happens with the county clerk record, because it has the minister's name, it leads you to a church record. So aside from that, mostly newspapers and the county clerk's records would be what's most helpful. And then of course later, if the couple ever got divorced, looking at the divorce record would tell you at least the date and the place of the marriage, but wouldn't provide you with a record for it.
All right. Let's see. And this was, I guess, most specifically to Hunterton, New Jersey, if you're familiar.
That question, the
Yeah,
marriage question, you mean, was
and the
specific to
birth
Hunterton?
too.
Okay, yeah. So I'm not 100% sure, but I believe the Hunterdon County Clerk marriage records are indexed on Family Search along with the rest of them. And aside from that, I know newspapers probably were a little more scarce in Hunterdon County at that point than they were in the bigger cities, so that may not be so helpful, but definitely check out the county clerk marriage records as well.
All right, well, it looks like that's it. We had a bunch of thank yous, and this was just a fantastic presentation. So I'd like to
Thank you.
thank our speaker for attending and putting this on. I'd like to thank everybody who attended to make this a wonderful experience for everybody. I hope everybody learned a lot. And please look out for an email from me that'll include a recap, the handout in case you weren't able to download it here, as well as links to some of the things that were discussed. So I hope everybody has an enjoyable week, is preparing for the 4th, and stay safe, stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.